Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. Today we'll be talking about how do scholars know that Paul wrote what they call the 7 authentic letters of Paul. There's 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, but scholars generally believe that only 7 of those, out of those 13, are genuine. And Frank's joining us today to discuss why that is. So thank you for joining me today, Frank.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and we have had some audio problems in the past, and hopefully we're not going to have them today.
Right. All right. Well, so how? Oh, go ahead.
Well, how do we know that there are 7 letters that we do not doubt their authorship by Paul? Well, why don't we go to the first slide? And this is what we call the Pauline corpus. My German colleagues refer to this as the corpus Paulinum, which is Latin for Pauline body. And the term Pauline corpus means it is a body of literature. And so when we use the term Pauline corpus, we are not claiming that that any or all of them are by Paul. But we are saying these are letters, or these are documents which have circulated in the manuscript tradition, and they are associated with Paul, or they have been associated with Paul at one time or another. And so that's an important point. By using the term Pauline corpus, it's simply a neutral term that we use to indicate the documents in the New Testament between Romans and Hebrews inclusive. And so in pretty much everybody since Vatican II rejects Hebrews as being by Paul. And it was rejected as being by Paul early on by one of the most famous biblical scholars of the early church, Origen, who said in his commentary, well, in truth, only God knows who wrote the epistle. And he said, if you recognize differences in phraseology, etc., you recognize that Hebrews is not by Paul. And so the early church was divided on whether Hebrews was by Paul. There are 3 letters that have been usually rejected as being by having been written by Paul, and those are the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And then there are 3 letters that there is more debate about: Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. I wrote a dissertation on 2nd Thessalonians. And those 3, the Colossians, the letter to the Colossians, the letter to the Ephesians, and the 2nd letter to the Thessalonians, we refer to these as the Deutero-Pauline letters. And there are significant differences between the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters, and also on the one hand, and the letters that I would call the authentic letters. By the way, the more diplomatic term now is the undisputed letters. And so there are differences. There are differences, literary differences. There are certainly theological differences. And we don't actually have any evidence that Colossians or Ephesians or 2nd Thessalonians was even written during the 1st century. Whereas we do have excellent evidence that Romans and 1 Corinthians, etc., those were written during the 1st century because they are quoted by the 1st letter of Clement. So there are different levels of certainty about authenticity or inauthenticity that New Testament scholars entertain. By the way, the Pauline corpus is the oldest collection within that collection known as the New Testament. If we could go on to the next slide, one of the things that's of interest to some is the fact that the order of the letters in the Pauline corpus is not according to date, not according to chronology, but rather there are letters by Paul to churches that are in order of length, and then letters by Paul to individuals, ostensibly in order of length, and then finally, the 14th document in the Pauline corpus is called the letter to the Hebrews. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see the letters of the Pauline corpus actually in the order we have them in the New Testament. And starting with Romans and ending with Hebrews. And you can see that they are actually organized fundamentally by length. Romans has 16 chapters. First Corinthians has 16, Second Corinthians has 13, Galatians has 6, Ephesians has 6, Philippians has 4, Colossians has 4, First Thessalonians has 5, but they are shorter, and then Second Thessalonians has 3. And then the next group is First Timothy, which is certainly longer than Second Timothy or Titus. And then the shortest letter of all is only 25 verses in one chapter, and that is the letter to Philemon. And then, as if the people who copied the Pauline corpus didn't really know what to do with it, or were just quite unsure about it, Hebrews is listed last and is found last in the printed Greek New Testaments that we know. And so the major evidence that we have for the existence of the letters of Paul of undisputed authorship, or generally undisputed authorship, is the existence of allusions to these letters in the Apostolic Fathers, most notably the first letter of Clement, the first and only letter of Clement, really. Clement was the head of the church in Rome in the late 90s. Traditionally, First Clement has been dated between 95 and 97 CE. And now the date is a matter of some debate. According to this marvelous edition of the Apostolic Fathers by Michael Holmes, the third edition, the traditional date is possible. But the problem is in First Clement 1:1, it says the sudden and repeated misfortunes and reverses. The question is whether the sudden and repeated misfortunes and reverses refers to a single event of persecution, or whether it does not. And if it does not, then the document could have been written anytime during the last 2 decades of the first century. In other words, from 80 to 100. And then if you go on to the next slide, there is actually further question about that. And by the way, when we talk about dates from the ancient world, we usually give a range of dates which are possible or likely. You know, we don't really know what happened in the ancient world. One time I was teaching on a Saturday morning at Codrington, and I said, well, you know, in America, if somebody is found guilty in a court of law in a criminal case, they have to be found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And all of my adult non-traditional students corrected me and said, oh no, Dr. Hughes, here in Barbados they have to be found guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's an extremely high bar of certainty or near certainty. That is just about the same as moral certainty, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And in America, usually in the States, it's in a criminal trial, it is beyond a reasonable doubt. And then the judge tells the jury what a reasonable doubt is. In a civil case in this country, it's just the preponderance of the evidence is enough to bring a judgment against a defendant. But in a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And so when we're dealing with antiquity, we cannot go beyond a shadow of a doubt, and we cannot usually go beyond a reasonable doubt. We can only basically say, looking at the evidence, such evidence as we have access to, we're talking about what is likely to have taken place. Okay. And when we can do that in antiquity, we're certainly doing our job. The earliest date that something can be is a terminus a quo, or the terminus from which. And the latest date is called the terminus ad quem, or the terminus ante quem, the terminus to which or before which. So the date that something can be in antiquity is between the terminus a quo and the terminus ad quem. And so when a written document is quoted in a subsequent written document, this quotation constitutes proof that the first writing both existed and was made available to the writer of the second document. Okay. Alternatively, you can also say that both documents have a common source. And for example, that's what we argue when we argue for the 230 or so verses common to Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. We frequently, on a good day, we say that they come from a common source, commonly called Q. At least that's a theory. So when we're dealing with things from antiquity, we are in fact dealing with the theoretical, and we have to be satisfied with what we have according to the predominance of the evidence, and that is the best we can do for materials that happen from that things that happened in the world 2,000 years before us. And then the terminus ad quem for Paul's authentic letters, the letters that we don't have doubts about their authorship, would be the death of Paul. And so that's why Pauline chronology is so important. And my teacher, Robert Jewett, calculated this in his book, A Chronology of Paul's Life. He calculated that at 62 CE during the reign of Nero. And then other chronologists have dates that are somewhat earlier or somewhat later. Gerd Ludemann's dates, and I studied with him for a year in Göttingen during my Fulbright year, and his dates are considerably earlier. And they have not, and his dates, I'm sorry to say, have not gained extreme acceptance because they are so early. But nonetheless, the terminus a quo for the Paul's authentic letters, it would be just after Paul founded the church to which he was writing. And so what really happens is Paul goes to a city and founds Church A, right? And then after a certain amount of time, in Thessalonica, it was like 3 Sabbaths, amazingly enough. Then he goes somewhere else, and then he hears that there are problems or there's reason to write a letter. And then in order to try to fix the problems, he writes a letter. Now in Corinth, he tries to fix the problems by writing letters and by sending his deputies, one of his deputies. And then finally, Paul makes a second visit to Corinth, and that turned out to be a disaster. And then Paul wrote the really nasty letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. But anyway, Paul's letters are usually in response to some problem. And we know about that problem because in the authentic letters, we have a great deal usually of local details in the letters. In other words, we learn about the Corinthian Christians from reading Paul's Corinthian letters. We learn about the situation in Galatia from reading Galatians. We learn about the situation in Thessalonica from reading 1 Thessalonians. So Paul's own letters that we don't have doubts about all have local details about the church. And of course, the local detail for Romans is Paul didn't found the church, but he knows about different Roman congregations, and he writes kind of a manifesto to the Roman congregations. He sends it by way of Phoebe, and he is trying to enlist their support to fund and facilitate his mission to Spain. And we learn that from reading Romans 15. So basically, Paul wrote his letters as fully situational letters based on things that Paul learned were happening in each of those churches. And so the exception to that is Romans, but I've explained that exception. And you can read that in Romans chapter 15, starting at verse 14, going through the end of the chapter. You learn a lot about Romans. And of course, you learn a lot about Romans from reading the greetings in chapter 16. You can go on to the next slide.
I have one question I want to ask real quick before we continue
Sure.
on the slides. So basically, what you said so far, from what I've gathered, you were saying that the extra biblical sources, like First Clement, for instance, are attesting to the existence of some or all, or at least some of the 7 authentic letters of Paul, but not the pseudo-Pauline and Deutero-Pauline epistles.
That's right. And I detail a little bit more of that further on in the slides. But yeah, there's not the slightest doubt that Paul is quoting early parts of the Corinthian correspondence. And it's very interesting that he doesn't quote 2 Corinthians, because when Clement was writing the Corinthian church, they had thrown out their presbyters, people like me. They had thrown out the presbyters, and those were the priests or presbyters that were the people doing ministry in the church in Corinth. And so Clement writes the Corinthian church on behalf of the Roman church, telling them, what you just did, you can't do. And it would have been tremendously helpful for what he was trying to do to quote 2 Corinthians, and it would be very appropriate for Clement to have quoted 2 Corinthians in order to convince the Corinthians that what they had done, you just can't do. But ironically, 2 Corinthians is not quoted. And that has been noted, of course, in Günter Bornkamm's famous article on the so-called second letter to the Corinthians. And so all of the apostolic fathers are important. Mostly the apostolic fathers are from the 2nd century. And First Clement, the first letter of Clement, really the only letter of Clement, I would say, has been dated in the last decade of the 1st century. It could be dated in one or more decades into the 2nd century, but that is still very early. That is still very early. That it certainly would be probably before Marcion. And so Marcion is not really in the picture here. But of greatest importance among the apostolic fathers is the first letter of Clement, which we call 1 Clement or 1st Clement. And if we could go on, Larry Wellborn wrote an excellent article called The Preface to 1st Clement, the Rhetorical Situation and the Traditional Date. And there was a set of essays on 1st Clement that were published by Cilius Breitenbach of the University of Berlin and Larry Wellborn of Fordham University, published in 2004. And in the final article in that collection, Larry Wellborn says, quote, "Thus we may place the composition of 1st Clement between 80 and 140 AD. The date range is much wider than the date range of 94 to 96. And yet it shows that by the late 1st century or perhaps the early 2nd century, this severe letter, 1st Clement, was written for the Roman Church to correct the church in Corinth, which had thrown their presbyters out of their office in the Corinthian church. And ironically, Clement used the example of Paul and even the texts of Paul's letter or letters to the Corinthians to tell the Corinthians, what you just did, you can't do. And we could go on. And so the question is, which letters of Paul did Clement of Rome know? And this is the most important question for Pauline scholars. And so you can trace them, because we actually have the Greek text of the Apostolic Fathers, and we have the Greek text of Paul. And so at Oxford University in 1905, in England, there was a group called the Society of Historical Theology, and they had a committee that actually looked carefully at the Apostolic Fathers, and most of them were more or less discovered in the 19th century, by the way. And so Kiersep Lake wrote this book on behalf of that committee. And then he examines each of the Apostolic Fathers. And he, ironically, what I did when I was talking earlier about this, I said, there are quotes or allusions that are really pretty much certain that there was a text of, 1 Corinthians, for example. And then there are some other quotes or allusions that you have big doubts about. And this committee classified the quotes and allusions according to A, B, C, and D. And if there was no doubt at all, they were A, and B, it was likely that they were quotes. And then D, C, it was not so likely, and then D, you really couldn't tell. And then also, Robert Grant made a book, had a translation and commentary on 1 Corinthians, and I looked at Robert Grant's list of quotations and allusions, and I'm going to describe that briefly in the next few slides, if you could go ahead. There are 50 allusions in Grant's list to 1 Corinthians, 3 allusions to Ephesians, 3 to the pastoral epistles, and 14 to Hebrews. And of course, he says, Professor Grant said exactly where they were in 1 Clement and where they were in these letters in the Pauline corpus. And of course, Kiersep Lake and the committee did that in much greater detail, actually looking at the Greek text of the New Testament and the Apostolic Fathers in parallel columns. But when you look at 1 Clement 46:6, it contains echoes of Ephesians 4:4 through 6. And that's what Grant said, and I find it to be a very weak echo. And then there were a couple of others in 1 Clement 14:3 and in 1 Clement 38:1 that I don't think that you can say anything. I don't think you can say anything. I reject those as being parallel. I reject those as being allusions. And if we could go on, there's also a hymnic statement or a hymnic phrase in 1 Clement 61:2, where it lauds God as the heavenly King of the ages, in which prays that the sons of men, it goes on to say, with piety and in peace and gentleness may administer the power given them. This is not a very convincing allusion to 1 Timothy 1:17. And Grant noted that, quote, it is more important to note that Clement goes well beyond anything in the New Testament. And then there's another phrase in 1 Clement 60, verse 4, which is a prayer for harmony and peace, and, quote, that we may become obedient to thy almighty and glorious name and to our rulers and governors on earth. It certainly is a parallel to the idea in 1 Timothy 2:7, where we're supposed to pray for rulers, but it doesn't necessarily appear to be an allusion to that text itself. It could be an allusion, but the evidence is certainly not clear that it is. If we could go on, and then there's a phrase that is found 3 times in 1 Clement 2:7 and 33:1 and 34:4 that could be parallels to Titus 3:1, where it says the person is supposed to be ready for every good work. But even Grant notes it may be proverbial. In other words, the proverb, a person who is supposed to be a Christian and active in the church is supposed to be ready for every good work. And so there are no direct quotations from the pastoral epistles. And then the allusions that are listed in Grant's table on page 104 may only truly be parallels. And okay, what's the reason for the parallels? If Pauline oral tradition was still alive and well in the last 2 decades of the 1st century CE, these parallels that you find in 1 Timothy and the pastorals could be accounted for as simply little phrases that were remembered, rather than a particular written text to which the letter of Clement of Rome actually referred. In other words, even without a text of the pastoral epistles that Clement might have, you could still have just pithy phrases that were remembered and that were, part of Christian teaching and preaching. They may have been part of Christian worship. Who knows? They could have been part of the exhortation to people at baptism. And so when you just have a few little snippets, you can't really establish that 1 Clement knew the pastoral epistles. And if you could go on, my analysis of the proposed allusions to letters of the Pauline corpus shows that 1 Clement only alludes to Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and Hebrews. And with the exception of Hebrews, and there are a lot of allusions to Hebrews, but Hebrews is anonymous, but the letters that are alluded to, if not quoted in 1 Clement, are all letters of Paul of undisputed authorship. And therefore, 1 Clement neither quotes nor alludes to Colossians, nor 2 Thessalonians, or the pastorals, or Titus, or Philemon. So there are some authentic letters that he doesn't allude to, but there are more or less all of the inauthentic letters that he does not allude to. And so it is therefore only the undisputed letters which are quoted in 1 Clement plus Hebrews, and minus 2 Corinthians. And therefore, the letters of doubtful Pauline authorship, the letters that we are interested in as to did Paul really write them, you cannot really confidently date them in the 1st century. And of course, you can date Pauline letters because you can date Paul. But if you cannot be sure that Paul wrote the letters because they're not quoted in the 1st century, then you cannot really you cannot be certain, and you cannot be confident whether Paul wrote them or not. But I am confident for other reasons that Paul did not write them. And so another book that came out more recently was Professor Margaret MacDonald's book. She teaches in Canada, and she did what I believe to be a Cambridge dissertation called The Pauline Churches. And she studied the sociological or social historical phenomenon of institutionalization. In other words, organizations start out with an original charisma, and then later, when the person dies, that charisma has to be institutionalized, and organizations start making rules for things. And so she examined the social phenomenon of institutionalization in Paul's undisputed letters, as well as the other letters in the Pauline corpus. And she concluded quite reasonably that there were more advanced levels of institutionalization in the Deuteropauline and pastoral letters than in the undisputed letters of Paul. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see that her analysis was not based on a literary or theological theory of how Paul's writings or theology developed, but rather it applied the sociological and socio-historical category of institutionalization to the letters attributed to Paul. And she concluded that the letters of disputed authorship reflect clear signs of the institutionalization of authority in ways that the undisputed letters do not. And so you can see that is a difference in between the disputed letters and the undisputed letters that is not based on theology and not based on trying to run down quotes, but it's based on what we can read in the letters about what the church at that time was like and how the church at that time was dealing with authority. And so when these letters deal with authority in ways that are that really make a lot more sense in the period after Paul's life, then that is another argument against their authorship by Paul. And so then if you go to the next slide, when I was teaching, I told the students that there are three kinds of issues. There's historical issues, and of course the quotes in First Clement, that would be historical. And literary is, when you start looking at words and you look at the number of words that are unique to a letter, we call those hapax legomena. That would be a literary consideration. And then when you start dealing with the theology of Ephesians or Colossians, for example, those are theological reasons. And then the fourth consideration is what sociologically these churches were like. And so that would be a fourth consideration, along with the historical, the literary, and the theological. So if you go on,
there's no more slides.
That's it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, when you look at the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence sways a large majority of scholars that Paul didn't write the pastoral epistles. And I would say a bare majority of scholars about Ephesians and Second Thessalonians, and a little bit larger than a bare majority about Ephesians. But Colossians and Second Thessalonians are the ones that are a little bit more on the edge, it appears. But anyway, that's what I did my dissertation on in 1984, and Bob Jewett directed it. He disagreed with it, and he saw to it that it was published in the JSNT supplement series.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. Hypothetical, if Acts were, say, fiction, and Jesus' death were not circa 30 CE, how would we date Paul?
Well, there certainly are aspects of Paul that are very difficult, if not impossible, to square with the letters. Like Acts is convinced that Paul is in Jerusalem 5 times. One of them is a planned time, and you can only read about 3 times for Paul to be in Jerusalem in the letters. But I don't have a problem with Paul. Paul goes around the Mediterranean Sea by land and sea, and that he founds churches, because we read that in the letters. We read that in First Thessalonians. We read about that in First Corinthians. Even First Corinthians 3, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So you can use Acts, but you have to be very careful how you use Acts. My teacher wrote a book called A Chronology of Paul's Life, and he said that if Acts doesn't conflict with the letters of Paul, you can use data from the book of Acts to do a chronology. Whereas John Knox, in his book, Chapters in a Life of Paul, and this was followed by Gerd Ludemann in his chronology book, that was published in 1984 in English, he says, well, John Knox called for a chronology of Paul based only on the letters. And that's what Gerd said that he was doing. So you have to read Gerd Ludemann's book, Paul, Apostle of the Gentiles, Studies in Chronology. Fortress published it in 1984, and you have to read that, and you have to decide whether Gerd Ludemann was really being consistent with this. The material that he was using was just from the Pauline letters or from external sources. So it's hard to do it without any information from Acts. And so Robert Jewett thought that there was some information in the book of Acts that you could use, but if it conflicted with information about Paul and his activities in the undisputed letters, then you couldn't use it. And so that's what he said he was doing.
I Fishnet, thank you for your super chat. Is there a way to know how many letters Paul may have written and we don't have? People often claim Paul never addressed X. He may have, and we don't have it.
Well, if we don't have the letter, if we don't have the Greek text of a letter by Paul, and we don't have that letter really referred to, then we cannot say that we know it. You know what you have evidence for. To quote the famous saying by Jacob Neusner, "What you cannot show, you do not know." And so, if there is a letter that you think exists, that's fine. Show me some evidence. And if you don't have any primary evidence, which would be the letter itself, or any quotations or allusions that make you believe that there was such a letter, then you don't have any evidence. And so if you don't have any evidence, then you can say anything you want, but the question is, your colleagues won't believe you, and they shouldn't.
So I want to go back to what you were saying earlier. You don't find the arguments for First Clement making allusions to the pastoral epistles and the Deutero-Pauline epistles to be very convincing.
Right.
Could you expand a little bit more on that? And my second part of that question is, do you suspect the Deutero-Paulines and pastorals could have been written after First Clement?
Well, yes, to answer your question, second question, yes, I do. I mean, the Deutero-Pauline letters were written, and we have the text. So we know that those letters did exist. The issue is, when were they written? And so if you go back to the slides, I examined several of the proposed allusions from Ephesians, and I concluded that one of them was very questionable, and even Robert Grant said that it was echoes of Ephesians 4:4-7, I think. And then the other two, I couldn't find any point of contact between Ephesians. And, just because you have a little pithy phrase or a little snippet, and you're just quoting a phrase, well, how do you know that came from a letter? If you have the text of the letter, or the text of the letter doesn't really match it very well, then it does not really constitute evidence for a quotation. Or even an allusion. A quotation would be a really good direct quote. And an allusion is a quote where, well, maybe the words are not word for word.
Hold on, Frank. It looks like the audio glitch has returned.
Oh, God.
That's what I was afraid of. Trying to see if I can... Try going to your settings and then like change which microphone you're using, if it lets you.
Okay, let me see if I can. I'll see if I can do that.
Yeah.
Okay, camera. We'll say it does. Oh, I think I took the other one off. I think I removed that other camera from the settings. Uh-oh, that's not a good idea. Let me see if I can put it back in. Well, I'm afraid I can't really do that because in order to kind of fix the problem, I actually took the HP microphone
Yeah,
out.
I think it. Well, anyway, why don't you back out the studio and then use the same link to rejoin? That should fix it for a little while, since we were able to go almost 40 minutes without this being an issue.
Okay. All right. I'll back out and then come back in.
Yep. All right, so he'll be back. Don't know why, but for some reason, sometimes it can take 12 minutes, and in this case, it took almost 40 minutes, and the audio on his end started glitching again. He'll be back in a second. We're not done yet. All right, Frank.
All right. Well, I'm sorry about this.
That fixed it.
Maybe when the new microphone comes next Wednesday, we'll be in better shape because that's the same microphone you're using.
I'm not using a webcam microphone like you are. I'm using this.
Oh, that looks like that's much fancier.
Yeah, it's a studio mic. Okay, so can you go back to what you were saying earlier before the issue came up?
Well, if you look back at the slides, I discussed the quotations or the alleged allusions to Ephesians, and I was working with Robert Grant's list, and then here in one of the early chapters, about the second chapter of this book by the Oxford Committee, it's right after the chapter on Clement of Rome. For example, there's a quotation from Romans in Romans 1:29 to 32. And it's in 1 Clement 35, 5 and 6. And then what the committee said 100 years ago, an examination of this passage makes it practically certain that Clement is influenced by the recollection of the passage in the Epistle to the Romans. This judgment is founded upon the remarkable coincidence of the vices which are mentioned. This seems too detailed to have occurred by chance. And the character of the concluding sentences in the two passages, it would be very difficult to imagine that Clement is here independent of St. Paul. And so there are quotations or allusions that are very, very strong allusions to Paul's letter to the Romans. And there's one or two that are very difficult to figure out. It's in First Clement. I'm not sure. There's several of them. And then the committee said, it is hardly possible to say here whether Clement is influenced by the Romans or the other epistles. And then when he gets to 1 Corinthians, quote, it says, it can hardly be doubted that many of the phrases in Clement were suggested by the recollection of the passage in Corinthians. etc. But then when you get to, well, then there are a whole bunch of them from Hebrews. But then when you get to some other places that it just, you just don't have a good case that could be made. And so there may be recollections, and of course, some of the recollections from the authentic letters may be just from memory, rather than actually looking at a written text. But then there are other recollections that just are not very strong at all. And those are the ones that you would classify using the committee's classification of C or D. So it's basically, you have to look carefully at the text and then consider the context and see if you believe it's likely that there was an actual written text that was being quoted. And so in some cases, it looks like perhaps a recollection from memory, which is not hard to believe, but not really a written text. And that really accrues to all of the Deutero-Pauline letters. On the other hand, the Deutero-Pauline letters and the pastoral letters, when they were written in the early 2nd century, perhaps, they also had recollections of things that Paul said that were not actually recorded in any of the authentic letters. So not only could First Clement have recollections of little snippets of teaching from the authentic Paul, so could the writers of Colossians, Ephesians, 2nd Thessalonians, or the pastorals. So in other words, just because you have written text, that doesn't mean that the oral tradition has died. So you can have recollection from memory without having an actual written text.
Could you go back to discussing what you mentioned last time about how you separated the different authors of Paul's letters by referring to them as different Pauls?
Yes, that was Bob's advice. And you know, he directed a dissertation he disagreed with. He argued in his book that Paul did write 2nd Thessalonians, and so we agreed to disagree. And he suggested that when the book came, or when the dissertation was done, and this is in about chapter 4 of Early Christian Rhetoric, I had suggested that when you look at the images of Paul in what appears to be the post-Pauline era, you know, we have an image of Paul that is a pretty consistent image of Paul when you're looking at the authentic letters. But when I looked at the images of Paul in the post-Pauline period, I could not narrow that down to one image. And so at Bob Jewett's suggestion, I actually said, well, I can identify 3 images of Paul in the post-Pauline period. And of course, the image that I believe that the writer of 2nd Thessalonians was against was the image of Paul that you see in Colossians and Ephesians. And I referred to that image as the Paul of heavenly teaching, because in Colossians, Christians are up in heaven already with Paul. See, they're not on the earth anymore. And so I call that the Paul of heavenly teaching. And then I call the image of Paul in 2nd Thessalonians as the Paul of apocalyptic retaliation. And then when I look at the pastoral epistles, especially 2nd Timothy and Titus, where the major consideration is church order, they're not primarily about theology, but about church order. I argued that Paul should be called the Paul of ecclesiastical authority. And that when you look in the post-Pauline period, after the death of Paul, and you're looking for images of Paul that you see, you cannot try to sand off the rough edges. You have to look at each of the images of Paul and just say, yeah, these images of Paul are here. And if these images of Paul are here, there must be some reasons for that. So I called it the Paul of heavenly teaching and the Paul of apocalyptic retaliation, and then the pastorals, um, that was the Paul of ecclesiastical authority. And I think that was kind of helpful.
Does this, in some sense, make it seem like we're dealing with more than one Paul in a way?
Well, when we're talking about the Pauline corpus, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most Paul scholars, we are dealing with more than one writer. I mean, when we're dealing with Romans, the 7 undisputed letters, in their unredacted state, in the case of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you're dealing with Paul. You're dealing with a very situational Paul. Paul is responding to different situations at different times in different Jesus believing communities. When you're reading Colossians, it's responding to a different situation. And I have argued, and others argue, that the real situation in Colossians and Ephesians is that the second coming has kept on not coming. The delay of the parousia is the major thing. In other words, the second coming keeps on not coming, contrary to what Jesus probably believed, contrary to what the Paul of both his earliest letter, 1 Thessalonians, and his final letter, Romans, believed. The second coming and the meeting of Christ in the air in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:3, that's going to happen in the future. And then the judgment, the courtroom scene a la Romans 8, that's going to happen in the future. And then when you look at Colossians, that meeting of Christ in a second coming is kind of not the deal, because we're already in the perfect presence of Christ, according to Colossians, because we're already up with Christ in heaven. Why do you bother with human rules? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. If you are risen with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, at the right hand of God. And so, as a result of Colossians theologizing that we're already up with Christ in heaven, and that we're already perfectly in the presence of Christ, that makes the parousia that Paul expected, that kind of puts that in the shade. That's not the part of the big picture anymore. So that too is a situational difference between Colossians and the authentic letters of Paul. Given that 1 Thessalonians, his earliest letter, and Romans, his latest letter, his final letter, both expect the second coming of Jesus.
And then my final question: was 1st and 2nd Corinthians compressed? Like 1st, 2nd Corinthians are many letters, as you and the late Bob Jewett pointed out. Were they compressed down to 2 letters after the Pseudo-Pauline and Deutero-Pauline epistles were created, or before, or simultaneously?
Well, I think that you have to look at the apparent redactional motivation for this collection called 1 Corinthians. And in our book, 1 Corinthians had a frame letter, and that frame letter is letter C. And that is a perfectly wonderful deliberative letter with a 3-part proof. And then the peroratio is 1 Corinthians 13, which recapitulates everything that's in letter C, but not everything in 1 Corinthians. So I think that when you look at the canonical form of this collection called 1 Corinthians, and you realize that it includes 1 Corinthians 14, 33b through 36, where women are supposed to be silent in church, etc., that does in fact match something of what you read in 1 Timothy, where women are not supposed to teach men. So I see real points of contact, and Bob agreed. We saw real points of contact between the Paul of the pastoral epistles and the Paul represented by the redaction of the Corinthian correspondence, especially the redaction of this thing called First Corinthians. So we see that as a point of contact, but we don't really see the issue being apocalyptic or when is the second coming. That's the issue for Second Thessalonians is, the second, you cannot say the second coming has already come, because here are the things that have to have happened before the second coming can happen. And so that is the issue for Second Thessalonians. And we don't see that in the redaction of either First Corinthians or Second Corinthians. So different redactions or different collections of Pauline material, they are allowed to have different issues that they are interested in. Everybody does not have to think the same thing to be part of the Pauline church after Paul's death.
We have a super chat question, so I'm going to take this real quick before we close. S. Mill, thank you for your super chat. If Paul did not die in 62 and was writing in 70-75 CE from an evolved theology, would that make the 6 disputed letters more likely?
Well, I think you'd be arguing against the church tradition, which is quite believable, by the way. You'd be arguing against the church tradition that Paul was beheaded while Nero was emperor. And that is a possibility, but I don't think that's likely. If he were writing in 70-75 CE, and his theology continued to evolve, but that's theoretical too, isn't it? Would that make the 6 disputed letters more likely? I don't think that when I wrote my book on Second Thessalonians, given that First Thessalonians was already in circulation and was possessed by the writer of Second Thessalonians, and that Second Thessalonians could use words and phrases from First Thessalonians and yet change the theology markedly, would it ever have been to Paul's advantage to write a letter saying in chapter 2, by the way, there are letters that are purporting to be from me, Paul. So kindly don't listen to anything by a spirit or a logos, an oral teaching, or a letter as from us, seeming to be from us, that says the day of the Lord has already come. Would it ever have been to Paul's advantage to suggest that there were letters in circulation that seemed to be from Paul, but were not really from Paul? That makes a great deal of sense when those letters were apparently in circulation after Paul's death. But for Paul, Paul can't travel around anywhere and everywhere at any time. See, sometimes he's in jail. And so it would never be to Paul's advantage rhetorically to suggest that some of his letters are fake and that they had the wrong teaching. Don't listen to anybody, either a spirit or a logos or a letter as from us that says the day of the Lord has already come. So in my view, and I argued this in the book, Early Christian Rhetoric, I argued that would never be to Paul's rhetorical advantage to have argued that. So if you argue that Paul somehow was not beheaded under Nero, contra the very, very believable church tradition that says that he was, then you're arguing something for which there's no real evidence. We have to take the evidence as it is, and there are a lot of people out there And they were all taught that Paul wrote all 14 letters of the Pauline corpus, including Hebrews. You know, in the King James Version of the Bible, it says the Epistle of St. Paul to the Hebrews. So a lot of people have it in their minds or in their guts that Paul wrote all these letters, and then people, liberal scholars like me, and most of the others of us, we are sort of, damn near unbelievers or atheists or something. And I'm obviously not an atheist, being a priest. And so my agenda is I want to have the most accurate view of Paul that I can come to. And I can only come to that by doing a rigorous historical and literary analysis of not only Paul's own letters, but also the letters attributed to him in the Pauline corpus. And therefore, if it's appropriate for us to do a careful historical, literary, rhetorical analysis of Paul's authentic letters, why wouldn't it be equally appropriate for us to do careful analyses using some of these same methods on the letters whose authorship we have doubts about?
So I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about First Corinthians, that has that little bit there that you suspect is an interpolation that parallels the pastoral epistles, the view of women in the pastoral epistles.
Right.
So would you say that if somebody would argue that was put in there to try to make authentic Paul look like he agrees with the pastoral epistles, would that make sense to you?
Either the pastoral epistles or the prevailing view in the church among some that have women as second or third class citizens and not capable of the top leadership in the church, which means that they are contradicting Romans 16:1 and 2 when you have Phoebe as a diakonos. By the way, it was not deaconess. The term deaconess didn't exist until the 4th century. Paul refers to himself and Apollos in 1 Corinthians 3 as diakonoi. And therefore, Paul argues that Phoebe, or he identifies Phoebe in Romans 16:1 and 2 as a diaconus of the church at Cenchrea, and kind of Paul's minister plenipotentiary and his delegate to read the letter to the Romans to the different Roman congregations. And then in Romans 16:7, you have Andronicus and Eunia. And so English translations created this word Eunias to be a male proper name. But that male proper name has never been attested, whereas Eunia is a well-attested Roman female proper name. And so Eunia and Andronicus are described in Romans 16:7 as well-known among the apostles. Not well-known to the apostles, but with the preposition in, it's the most likely reading is well-known among the apostles. And so women also in letter A of Corinthians, letter A, women are supposed to be veiled if they preach or prophesy. Well, if a woman is preaching and prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11, then how is it that she's supposed to be silent in 1 Corinthians 14? See? So if women are exercising ministry in churches, including Phoebe, who is a diakonus, the same term that Paul uses for himself and Apollos, who are, by the way, apostles, and then even uses the term apostle, a well-known apostle, for Eunia. I think that you have to decide which evidence you believe. Sometimes you have evidence that doesn't really appear to fit, and so you have to look at the evidence. And so I think the preponderance of the evidence is that Paul considered women as equal or just about equal missionary partners, like Phoebe, like Eunia, and like others that are not named. Among New Testament writers, the only ones that are actually where women are actually given names and are named as having ministry in Pauline churches or churches after the resurrection is Paul's letters. Paul is the only one who lists women as being in ministry and uses technical terms for them. See? So I think that you have to look at the evidence carefully and try not to overlay the prejudice against women in the top leadership of the church, which we know all about from subsequent centuries of church tradition.
So we do have another super chat. Hi, Fish and Tie. Thank you for your super chat. My question earlier, Matt, how many letters did Paul probably write to churches? Dozens, hundreds? And we only have 7.
Well, you only have 7 if you count 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians as 2. Whereas in our Corinthian book, the Corinthian correspondence, we count 8 Corinthian letters and letter fragments. And so if you count, let's see, 7 letters minus 2, 7 letters minus 2 is 5, and then you add 8, that means 13. So unless we have a Greek text of a letter, or we have somebody quoting a letter that is a really believable quote, we don't have any knowledge of a letter that Paul wrote. I mean, the beauty of the 7 undisputed letters is that we have the text. And when you don't have the text of a letter, or you're only quoting it, and the quotes appear in somebody that has a very different opinion about them. So when you're looking at letters, and you don't have the letter itself, then your evidence is not that strong. So I think it's very likely that Paul wrote other letters than the ones that we have in the New Testament, letters and letter fragments, of course. And maybe it's possible that they could be discovered someday. And if they are discovered someday, then the Greek text will be published. And then people like me will look at the text and see if we think this makes any sense as a Pauline letter. But I don't think that's happened just yet. But on the other hand, no one would have predicted that the Dead Sea Scrolls would have been discovered by a little Arab boy and his goat in 1947. So, I mean, it's possible, but we have to look at the evidence that exists rather than try to think about evidence that we have no idea whether it existed.
So I'll have a link to Frank's book in the description below and the pinned comment. It's called The Corinthian Correspondence. And I just want to thank everybody for watching the stream. And thank you for joining me today, Frank, and Happy New Year's.
Happy New Year's. And I'm looking for that new webcam on Wednesday. So next Wednesday, or maybe Monday. And we'll see. We'll maybe try it privately to see if we're having. I hope it's a microphone issue. I
think I know it. I think I might have figured out what the real cause is, but I'll talk to you about it after the stream.
Okay.
Let me just close out real quick.
Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.